Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, but you haven't introduced yourself. Well, someone who needs no introduction on Musical Talk, of course, is our own David Kingsmill. As you may remember from a series of episodes that we had with him last year, he has this strange tendency of living in one country, but talking about the shows that he's seen in another. Last year, if you recall, he was telling us all about his experiences on Broadway and the shows that he saw there. But at that time, he was living in London. Well, he's now living in Canada, and therefore we're going to be talking about the shows that he saw in the West End in London. Now, I recorded this interview with him towards the beginning of last year, and so the shows that he's going to be talking about this week and next were all on in London in 2013, 14 and 15. And really they're the highlights of the many shows that he saw over that period. This week we're going to be talking about Merrily We Roll Along, that masterful revival, which you may remember everyone was talking about in London, but also Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Rock of Ages, and the Scottsboro Boys. And that's just this week. And there'll be other shows that we spoke about next week, but that's the ones we're getting in this week's conversation. And I should just say that at the time of this recording, I hadn't yet seen the Scottsboro Boys, but as you know, I subsequently did with Tim Saywood, and we discussed it in another episode of Musical Talk, which is still available on our website. Details of our new website are at the end of this programme. But let's not beat around the bush or hoover near a shrubbery. Let's get straight on with this conversation with David Kingsmill about the shows in the West End that he saw in his continuing stage odyssey. Musical Talk. David.
Hello, sir.
Now, this, in a way, is going to be, I think, a sort of a kappa, an epilogue to a sort of little sort of trilogy of episodes of Musical Talk that we've recorded.
Indeed.
The last two have been notable by being your trips to Broadway.
Yes.
And what you've seen on the other side of the Atlantic, reported to us here in Britain.
Yep.
Now, at the time that this is going out, we've reversed that completely because you're on the other side of the Atlantic, and we're now going to be talking about the shows you saw in Britain when you were here. So there is a certain perfection and symmetry to this.
There is.
And I think also by pointing that out, I've rather neatly set us up for the episode because we've explained the concept.
Indeed.
So just briefly then, tell us, what period are we talking about here?
So this is essentially... Well, I left for Canada, as people may remember, in September 2012. So this is essentially the period between then and, well, now as we speak, which is February 2015.
So it's just over a year, really, isn't it?
So it is.
For all intents and purposes, it's a fat and slightly oozing in both directions 2014.
Yes,
and
there's a little drip. There was a 2-week period when I came back in 2013, and I saw a couple of shows then, so they will also be included.
So let's get that particular show rolling. Merrily We Roll Along, which I don't think is...
It was absolutely one of the ones. Well done. And for listeners, we did not plan that in advance. That's just us being psychic, apparently. Yes,
I can promise that again.
I did see Merrily. This was after it had transferred to the Pinter. And as I don't know if I've mentioned this particularly on the podcast, but I think that, along with Sweeney, fluctuate as being my favourite musical, depending on what kind of a mood I'm in and whether I, how I particularly want to challenge myself at the time. But it's also one that I never really had the chance to see, because Merrily is done very, very rarely.
I think it's going to be done a lot more now, since this one, so in a way, feels as though it broke the public perception of it, because it was always seen as an excellent Sondheim that didn't do well.
Well, I think the big problem was, when it first came out, it was so spectacularly ahead of its time, because this was, I want to say mid-70s?
I think it's about 90, it's the one after Sweeney Todd, so I think it's 81, something like that.
Oh, okay, fair enough. My timeline's a bit wonky, but for those...
It is ahead of its time, because obviously its stroke starts, stroke ends in the 50s. So.
Indeed. But for those who don't know Merrily, for one reason or other, it's based on a play, the name of which currently escapes me. But both play and musical work in the same way, which is to say that they start at the end of the show, and they start at the end of the timeline.
Yeah.
of the show, and they end at the beginning of it. So the entire show chronologically moves backwards.
It's Merrily We Roll Along backwards.
Yes, exactly.
There's one word missing.
Merrily We Roll Back, potentially. But it was one of those things where at its time the audiences weren't quite ready to face something like that. Now, obviously, it's probably a concept that may be more familiar to the wider audience these days with the last 5 years, although that, of course, moves in both directions. But when Merrily came out, I think it ran for 16 performances on Broadway, if memory serves. It really had a tough time of it and closed very quickly. Now, there's been, to my knowledge, I think there are 4 recordings of it, including the one that was made in 2013 in the Lincoln Center. And then there was, I think there was a 2000 to 1984 and 1994 or something like that. But there's been quite
various tinkerings with it.
There have been. And actually, one of the things that was notable about the 2013 recording is that Jonathan Tunick said, "This is Merrily We Roll Along, finally the way that I always wanted it to be."
Oh, right, okay.
So he's filled in the gaps and bumped up the orchestration to where he originally envisioned it. Of course, what it doesn't have, which I always think is a great shame, is the wonderful song The Hills of Tomorrow, which was only ever in the first production, and I think they felt it broke up the show a little bit too much. And I can see where they're coming from, but it was also a nice bookend.
Do you know, my problem with that song is dramatically it works perfectly, as you say, as bookends. And of course, musically it works perfectly because actually it's a very basic version of a thematic leitmotif which we're going to hear or will have heard throughout the piece, you know, becoming more and more sophisticated depending on which way you're travelling in terms of time. And yet, I love the score of Merrily We Roll Along. It is one of my favourites sometimes, but I don't like that song.
Fair enough.
It does what it has to do without me liking it.
Yes, I understand that. I think it's one of those things that's very Marmite. I think it really does either appeal to you or not. I think I've always enjoyed close harmony singing, and I think that therefore appeals to me through that route.
Do you know, that's a really interesting insight, because of course, yes, it's a kind of school chorus number, isn't it?
It is. Well, it's... Sorry, go on.
Well, no, and I was going to say, I have never liked chorus singing. I have never liked a cappella and choirs, and they can go back down their Welsh minds as far as I'm concerned, whether they be Welsh or not.
One of those ways that we differ, I know. And because in the context of the story, it's actually the valedictorian song that Frank Shepherd, the central character, actually writes for his class, and is meant to be sort of the start of this wonderful career as a composer.
It's a school anthem, isn't it?
I think what the problem was, potentially it's slightly out of place. One other thing that it occurs to me that it does do is when he presents it at the beginning of the show, he comes across as extremely arrogant, which is what he is at the end of the chronology, which is the beginning of the show.
Yes.
And I feel like playing that again as the bookend at the end of the show, which is the beginning of the chronology, and therefore where it technically would have sat in the chronology, it reminds us of him as an arrogant man.
Yes.
Whereas, of course, at the end of the show, you're actually seeing him and his friends in their most hopeful longing. They've just seen Sputnik go over them, and they're sort of saying, this is now we're at that stage of our lives where we can do anything that we want. And I think having that reminder...
They're filled with vision, whereas later on they are just a sight.
Yes, and they become the sort of cliched, fractured three-person working team. And I feel like it reminds us of that at a point where that's not really what the show's trying to do. And one of the things that makes the ending so devastating is the fact you know they're not going to work out, and yet they've got this beautifully hopeful song, which quite frankly had me in tears. I thought it was brilliantly done, and the concept of that is so powerful. And then to suddenly block something on the end, I think, I see why it was taken out, but I do think it's a shame.
So what did you make of the production you saw in London?
Loved it. I've read quite a lot about what people had problems with when they actually first saw the show. I don't know how many of those were addressed.
Sorry, you mean when they first saw the show?
I beg your pardon.
80s,
sorry,
or in this
when it was first put on Broadway.
Oh, right, yes.
I read quite a lot about the issues that people had with it then and why it failed. Also, I think there's a bit about that in Meryl Seacrest's biography of Sondheim as well, if I recall. And seeing, I don't know how much was addressed in the intervening productions, but seeing it now, I feel like it seems to me to be a much clearer, clarified production.
Yes.
And it made, like, even though it was still going backwards, you never felt at any point like you'd lost track of what was going on, which I feel is what people were doing. Whether that's because contemporary audiences are more used to for want of a better phrase, time travel aspect, which is in some ways what it's driving at. I don't know, because obviously we are more familiar with that concept nowadays, but it's not science fiction-y, I hasten to add. This is no Doctor Who.
Or Sliding Doors.
Or Quantum Leap, or oh no, I'm going back to being a child again. But it's that simple thing that things don't quite go the way you expect them to, and I think perhaps it was jarring at the time, and it makes more sense now. But Maria Friedman's production, I really struggled to fault it.
I too, but I did have one comment when I saw it in London, and I'd just be interested in your view on this. I felt that it was ever so slightly, and this is such an odd thing to criticise a theatrical show for, but it was over-theatrical. Now, this isn't because it is a show about putting on various numbers of shows, or a show about a lyricist, a writer, and a composer and people like that, who are in the business, as it were. It was none of that. It was something, I think, to do with the sheen of the direction. It's hard to pin down, but I noticed it most actually in the scene when we get Franklin Shepherd Inc., that fantastic Gilbertian showstormer.
Beautiful piece of music. Absolutely love it.
Yeah.
I want to play Frank in that show for every possible reason, except for the fact that Charlie gets to sing that.
I can accept that, absolutely. I mean, I'll ask you a question in a minute, but...
Yes.
When that, and then there's, there's all that problem on set, and I think there's a kind of television runner who shouts, "Oh God," after they walked off stage for a comic effect.
Yes.
But there was something about it which made me think, oh, this has got... It actually lost truth for me, funnily enough.
I think I know what you're driving at.
It was heightened rather than underplayed, but just occasionally I felt that missed the point. But when I say that, I'm talking at such a minor level that it's almost churlish of me to mention it.
Well, but I see. I know where you're coming from, and I feel like the way the direction was done, there were almost a couple of glancing blows off the fourth wall.
Yes, nice.
And I think that's probably... I hadn't thought about it. I think because I was so taken with it.
Yes.
Especially given that it was the only chance I'd had to see it. And I actually got to stay. There was a Q&A afterwards, the night that I went, which I knew nothing about, and I managed to blag my way into that somehow. I think you were supposed to be ticketed for it or something, but anyway. And I was so taken with the whole thing that perhaps it didn't catch me quite as much. But thinking back...
It was a Franklin
admittedly
Shepherd
quite a while.
Sorry, carry on.
Oh dear. They really don't get any better. Drinking game. How many podcasts have I said that in?
All the ones with me, I
imagine. Probably. But yeah, I do see where you're coming from with that. I do agree with it, I think, but perhaps you're a little bit more sensitive to that than I am, and so it missed me a little bit, or maybe it just didn't bother me as much, I'm not sure. But yeah, I do see that.
Now, my question to you,
yes.
This is a question I do like to ask people, particularly as you are, you're both a lyricist and a composer.
I am.
Who do you have greatest sympathy for? You cannot say Mary, because I know you're a writer as well.
Well, that's the obvious answer. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, because I think they both Frank and Charlie have their own... They both have character flaws, and actually what I think's so nicely written about this is they both have their own reasons to have those character flaws. I think Frank is, if I may use such language, more of an arse.
Yeah, he's shallow.
At the end of his chronology, so the beginning of the show. And I think you come into the show with a very negative opinion of Frank, whereas I think Charlie is seen as this one who, where Mary is trying to bring them back together, I think Charlie would like them to get back together, but he's just given up.
Yeah.
And I think where the difference lies between them is that you see more of a redemption from Frank because he has more to be redeemed of.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Now, in many ways, you're sort of unredeeming him because it is going backwards. So you're seeing what he was like before he became this jaded, rather unpleasant human being, essentially. I think in the grand scheme of things, I probably sympathise a little bit more with Charlie. The reason being, I think Charlie gets left behind when Frank becomes the big film composer, and Frank never really credits him after that point.
Yeah.
And I think that happening in a writing team would be devastating. Well, it would be devastating. I don't think there's a think about it. And it's one of those things where, yes, Charlie has his flaws, but I think Frank gave him the reasons for those flaws, whereas Frank's reasons came from the outside world having an impact on him. And really, it is Frank's fault that the team broke up.
So I think we can say, therefore, from the way you're describing it, that Charlie has integrity, but he is also integrated. As you say, the reason for his flaws come from the circumstances rather than...
And he finds it... I mean, my interpretation, you never see that much of this, but my interpretation of this is that he finds it very difficult to break out on his own once Frank goes off away. So Frank just disappears off into Hollywood, which is the entire point of Franklin Shepherd Inc., of course, and becomes this very successful sort of man about his business. And Charlie just kind of gets the odd paycheck, almost as a, well, you haven't got any work and I'm not so here's a handoff.
Well, it's a suggestion, isn't there? I mean, there's a big faux pas at a party which is in the later chronology.
Yes.
Where someone mentions how well the new Charlie Kringus play is doing on Broadway. But I think we have to assume he's the equivalent of David Hare in the sense that it's a sophisticated, high-ranking piece.
I think so.
Which would probably appeal to a theatre-going public rather than a mass audience. So
yes.
I agree. He sort of goes off into a niche, perhaps.
That's it. He does. He has the references. So when I say it's barely referenced, it's you do get the sense that he's done something, but he's always overshadowed from that point. Yes. Perhaps I think that's more what I'm driving at. And Frank is always the bigger figure from those days on. And to be fair, Hollywood versus Theatreland, he's always going to be the bigger figure. So I understand where that's gone, and I do feel. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's the rationale for my answer, but I think Charlie's the one that has the harder time of it.
My final question for you then, on Merrily We Roll Along, is that this version in London, which we both saw, although not together, does have the redemption, as you call it, because at the very end, Frank, as an old man, does recognise publicly his debt to Charlie.
He does.
So my question to you is, in that version of Merrily We Roll Along, which of course is not the same as all the previous versions, do you think that Frank and Charlie have any form of rapprochement? I'm not talking about working together again, but do you think they have, after that moment, what happens? What happens in Merrily We Roll Forwards?
Well, I rather want to refer to Christopher Nolan here and the wonderful spinning top scene from the end of Inception that's driven everybody completely bonkers. In case I've left anyone behind with that particular...
Possibly me.
Fair enough. Particular reference. It's the concept that if the last image of the film is a top spinning, and if it keeps spinning, then the main character is still in a dream world, and if it falls over, then he's in real life. And the very last thing you see it spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. There's a tiny little wobble and then black straight away.
So you don't know.
So you don't know. And I rather feel like that's what's happened in this. And you're left very deliberately having to make your own mind up about what's happened. And it works when that's... Now, it's never going to happen with a piece of musical theatre the way it would happen in Hollywood. The explosion of fan theories about whether it's in real life or not. Obviously, all films contain mistakes, and people are picking on the mistakes and saying, this isn't a mistake, it's a foreshadow. You don't get that with this.
No, you don't.
And I feel like the only reason I think perhaps there is a rebonding of sorts is precisely because of where it happens in the play. It has to happen there, because if you see them become friends again right at the top of the show where it would chronologically fit, then the entire rest of the show is blown open.
Yes, absolutely.
Equally, the fact that it happens just after you've seen them being all hopeful colours what you then see. Because you're in a naturally happy place and your inclination is to want them to get back together again. I'm inclined to think that there is a rebonding of sorts. Whether they become the best friends that they were for so long in their lives, I think probably not. But I suspect they probably start having drinks every couple of months in a way that they may not have done beforehand. That would be my interpretation, but that's solely my thought. What about you?
I agree with you to a degree, but I don't think it would be as close as that. I think what would happen is they'd meet again, discover they were still different people, but no longer the animosity. I think they will rely on Frank to make an approach to Charlie rather than the other way around.
I think so.
But assuming that happened, I think what they would then do is, I think every few years they'd meet each other on a television show talking about their musical theatre days, actually.
That's also... Perhaps I'm seeing the world through rose-tinted glasses when I talk otherwise.
You're a much more optimistic person than I. They all die horribly in a pit of acid. How's that?
Oh, Hamlet, right.
I don't know the pit of acid, but you're on the essential right lines. Yes, fine. So that's Merrily. So
yes.
What are the other shows that feature large in your memory?
Well, it's actually 2013 was quite a good... I'm going to preface this, actually. Well, we've already done one show, but I'm going to mention here that I had a rather horrible catastrophe a few months ago, and my MacBook died a horrible, horrible death, which took with it my calendar and the list of all the shows I'd seen. And most of my programs are in storage somewhere. So I'm doing everything that we're talking about today from memory, which means a lot, I see a lot.
Yes.
And particularly, last year it was very early year heavy, so most of what I'm talking about is a long time ago, so bear with me while I recoup what I can. But anyway,
that's very good, because this will be a self-selecting
quite possibly
bunch of shows.
Quite possibly, although admittedly when I was trying to come up with a list in my head of what I'd seen recently, I did miss out one of the shows that I thought was the best that I'd seen just because I wasn't thinking about it. But anyway, 2013, the interesting one, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Oh, right. Very interested to hear your view on this. You must have seen that when it was fairly new.
Absolutely, yes. I think it had been open for about a month and a half. This was July 2013. I don't remember exactly when it opened. It was, well, to be honest, my feeling with this one is... Douglas Hodge was amazing for a start, but then he always is, so that's not really a surprise. I felt a little bit let down, because after something like Catch Me If You Can, I felt like this really wasn't Shyman and Whitman at their best, which I thought was a terrible shame, because I went in I knew I was expecting a kids show, which obviously Catch Me isn't, or at least it's not aimed at kids. I knew that I was expecting something that I was going to be surrounded by children who are probably going to be having a better time than I am by default.
Can I just very briefly intrude here?
Yes.
A children's show rather than a family show? Because I expected a family show.
Okay, fair enough.
I got a children's show.
Actually, yes, I think that's better. Family show is a better description, but I think children's show is what came out. Yes, that's a very fair comment, and I'm using the wrong terminology there. But yes, and you do get that. And I got the families, and I was surrounded by a load of children who I think were having a better time than I was. The saving grace for this, and this is really why I bring it up, just because I love it, is the song at the end of Act 1, which is the It Must Be Believed to Be Seen.
Oh, right,
which is Wonka's first appearance. You don't see him in all of Act 1 until the last sort of 6 or 7 minutes.
Is this the Scratch It song?
Scratch It?
He's got this kind of speech mannerism, isn't he, where he gets things muddled up. So
no, that's...
Scratch
Reverse that, delete it, or something it's called. I can't remember exactly. But no, It Must Be Believed to Be Seen is actually quite dark. And I think that's why I enjoyed it. He comes out and he's got this very... It's almost Wolf from Into the Woods. And he has this very beyond this door lies chocolate. And it's all very creepy, and it's got this very sort of...
children, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it was this weird sense of, for 6.5 minutes, or however long the song lasts, I thought they were going to totally redeem the show in Act 2, which sadly they didn't. Or I feel they didn't, and, I'm maybe being a bit harsh, but...
So this is the Brothers Grimm moment, where Roald Dahl actually does well. Roald Dahl was a great writer of tales for children and adults, with twists,
absolutely,
quite often macabre and dark.
Well, and if you really read into
his... feel you're going in for.
Yeah, if you read into his work, there's some terrifying things in it, in a way. And I do feel like it was this salacious, dirty old man almost, which is not a fair description because he's not being sexual about it. But yes, you get this sense of his head's not entirely screwed on properly, and he might just suddenly lash out, which of course he does in the books, and relatively well in the films. But I think he's a bit more aggressive in the books. But that song just it remains one of my favourites to this day, despite the fact that I think it's the only piece of the soundtrack that is still on my iPod.
That's very interesting because as we're on the score, I can remember nothing from the score except the song we were talking about.
Strike that, reverse it. That's what it's called.
And I remember that for the lyric,
yeah,
because at least they had set up his sort of vocal mannerism or tick, which then made that song work, and that was fine. I can't tell you how it sounded, but I was tolerably impressed by the lyric.
The lyric was very impressive in that one,
yes.
The
song that impressed me most, or the one I enjoyed most, and I found myself whistling on the way home, was Pure Imagination, which of course is the Anthony Newley, Leslie Brickus number.
Absolutely.
From the film, interpolated, and that shouldn't happen in a new show.
No, I was very, very surprised when that came up, and I looked at it, and I didn't know how to react. Because on the one hand, there's ostensibly this brand new musical which doesn't have music from the film, and then all of a sudden you have the most famous song of the film shoehorned into the back end.
Which is exactly what happens in The Producers, of course.
Valid, yes. But the flip side of that is I thought that their reorchestration of it was brilliant.
Oh, yes.
And I thought the listening, once I'd accepted that they'd done it.
Yeah.
And I don't like shoehorning of things. It's like I hate a show that suddenly has a parody moment in it that wasn't there before. Yeah. And it was a perfectly original show, and then all of a sudden, bang, parody comes out of left field, and you wonder where it came from. And that's what happened here. But once I got past that, I thought, wow, they've actually done a really good job on this. And if you're going to have to do it, at least they've done it right.
Yeah.
I didn't mention that as a standout moment. Largely, I suppose it did stand out because it was so odd having it there. But it didn't have quite as much of an impact on me, I suppose.
Was it moving?
Not far enough. No, that's not fair at all. I've just been waiting a long time to use that answer. Not to me.
Yeah, not to me either.
But I think perhaps somebody who went in having, and this is a very small group of people, I would imagine, but somebody who went in having never read the book or seen either film version, it might affect them more.
You might wonder why they would go in and see it, but I accept the
Well, there is that. Yeah. Although you might just get somebody who goes, "Oh, it's a musical. It's in a big theatre. It's glitzy. If you know people, it's got Douglas Hodge or whoever happens to be in it now." But it would. I don't imagine somebody who knows it well being moved by it.
there was one moment where I felt genuinely moved, and it was just a little moment. I'm not a great fan of child actors.
Right.
That's not their fault. It's just that I just generally find
Fair
in
enough.
those cases they don't have the emotional depth or breadth or experience, but they need to carry off something that's satisfying emotionally. However, and I don't know the name of the actor I saw on the night because obviously they rotate, and he put in an adequate performance, but it was nothing great to write home about, except one moment, which is that moment when he finds the golden ticket. And it was done so beautifully, understatedly, but
Actually,
there was a tiny little crack in the young man's voice.
No,
It was kind of, because at that time I think he actually just wants the chocolate.
Yeah.
I can't remember the ins and outs of it, but there was.
No, I don't either.
He bought it. He sort of gets the ticket by accident.
Yes.
And it was just a kind of a golden ticket, but it was so. That was a beautiful moment.
It was.
And the
Actually, I agree
actor
with
carried
that.
that off. And I tell you what's interesting. That's the non-Disney moment, if you like. We were talking about
it is
because it's not it's not punching the air. I've got the ticket. That's a kind of losing breath from one's lungs with surprise.
And actually, to be fair, that runs against, if I remember correctly, what the novel has him doing, where the novel has him realising he's got just enough money to buy one more and he's going to have another go at the ticket. Whereas I do feel like the way it was done in the musical, you're right, he wanted the chocolate and, oh, hello, here's ticket number 5. I agree, actually, I hadn't thought about that particularly, and I suppose it says something that it didn't stand out in my memory quite as much as in yours, but now that I think back to it, I do agree, and I think there were a couple of moments in that show where he stood out, but I do see where you're coming from also with the child actor perspective. They don't have, an extra decade's worth of experience that the younger musical theatre actors who are coming in not as children would have.
And not everyone's a Jamie Bell,
No.
using a different musical, but there we are.
No.
Another question for you.
Yes.
What happened? Do you have any memories of the great glass elevator? Was it done well? Because I'm going to tell you how it was done the night I went.
Honestly, I don't really remember.
Well, that's probably a good sign. Because the night I went, it was rackety in the extreme. Obviously, I don't think I'm breaching any confidences by saying it's obviously a sort of a cantilever kind of piston thing that goes up. It's sort of carried up, presumably by a JCB around the back.
Sounds
so
about right.
It's a big plastic perspex lift, as you'd expect, and you see rather clumsily the night I went, Willy Wonka and Charlie get strapped into it, so that if it does go horribly wrong...
Oh, I remember now.
But then it wobbled as it rose, and it rose rather jerkily, so it wasn't a smooth rise like a lift. It looked like it was being held up by the back by a piston on a cantilever. And then it got to the top and it wobbled away while they were talking about the wonder of imagination. And then it sort of very slowly jerked its way back down to the ground again. And I've been in office lifts, which have been more magical and smooth. It was embarrassingly poor.
I do remember actually the wobble.
That's not the actor's fault in any way.
Yeah.
But I wondered if that was just my bad luck on the night. Because the night I went, I had 2 understudies. I had an understudy for Grandpa Joe, so I didn't see Nigel Planer. I had an understudy for Willy Wonka, so I didn't get that much. This was on a Saturday night. And it's not to say the actors who were replacing them didn't put their all in. They certainly did, and I'm not going to criticise them for not being the people I expected to see. But somehow, I have to say that I don't feel I saw an absolutely A-rated West End performance. I feel I saw a B-rated West End performance. I was slightly disappointed. In fact, I was massively disappointed.
I feel like I remember a little bit of wobbling at the top, because now that you're talking about strapping in, I do remember a bit about it. It doesn't stand out massively in my mind, so I'm going to guess that maybe you saw a particularly dodgy night, and
possibly.
It might not be the most stable of structures, but it certainly sounds like it was more stable than... Unless I just blanked it out of fear for the actors, which is also a possibility. But yeah, nothing further stands out particularly there.
I was disappointed by Willy and the Chocolate Factory? Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, or whatever it's called these days.
Yes, Willy Wonka was the... oh, good lord, which way around is that? That was the
Gene Wilder film?
Gene Wilder film, yes.
Which is one of my generation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was a little disappointed as well. I went in not expecting too much, and I think what disappointed me was the fact that I came out without my expectations being not blown out of the water, but certainly I got what I thought I was going to get, and
I got less than I was expecting.
Okay.
Was Nigel Planer any good as Grandpa Joe?
He was.
I'd like to have seen him.
And to be fair, that's the first time I've had a chance to see him. I've missed him as all the other people I've wanted to see, and yes, he did a great job as that, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. So yes, I think the two of them, you were very unfortunate not to get them, because I think they both did a fantastic job with their roles.
And I have no doubt, yeah.
But yes. So that was Charlie. I know there was one show I'm forgetting.
Sorry, have you noticed both shows so far have got a Charlie?
I've got Charlie.
Yeah.
Well, the next one. Does the next one? I don't think it does. We should probably put people out of the misery in terms of the show that we have mentioned and hinted at very, very unsubtly in the past that I saw in 3 different countries, which is, of course, Rock of Ages. Most people, I'm sure, have guessed that from what we've said previously. But I saw that both in London in 2013, and I think I can't remember if it was 2012 or 2013 in Canada, and also in New York. Now, I saw the Canada, it's the Toronto episode of the North American tour. I saw that first, and I have to say I was extremely disappointed.
Oh, right.
Maybe it was in too big a venue, potentially, because it was in the Sony Centre over there, which is a very large auditorium. And
Rock of Spaces, but that doesn't quite work.
No, not quite. I get what you're going for. What I felt with that was that it was terribly under-energised. And that went for most levels, like the orchestra even, sorry, not the orchestra, the band, which, for anybody that hasn't seen it, is on stage at the back of the show. Even they were under-energised compared to what I later saw. Now,
so why did you go back in 2 further countries?
We went to New York, and it was one of those, let's see how it's done right. Because I guessed that it was the tour that was letting things down. I was told that tours sometimes don't represent a show well.
The punch can go out of them.
I think one other thing was that in Canada, I'm not sure if it was due to laws or just due to that place, I forget now, to be honest, but they weren't doing what they normally do in New York, which is serving alcohol right through the show.
Right.
The whole time along, they're coming along offering
the music hall tradition
shots. Yeah, absolutely. It really, in many ways, but it also made it feel like more of a rock concert. Like you were for most of it, you were sitting down. To be fair, you weren't standing up and bouncing around. But it gave you that ability to immerse yourself a little bit more into the world that they were in, especially given that most of this is set in a bar.
Yes, of course.
And what really worked well in New York was the fact that it was in a small theatre. It was not claustrophobic exactly, but it had that packed sense that you get from going to see a rock gig somewhere. And the energy level was through the roof by comparison to Canada. And it was just brilliant. And in actual fact, we saw it twice in New York, because the point where we left on, I think, the Monday morning, and we wanted to see something on the Sunday night, and there were only about 3 shows on, and that was one of them. And we went, well, you know what, that was great first time, let's go again. And went and saw it again, and it was just as good the second time around.
So why did you come to see it in London?
Actually, largely because Simon Lipkin was in it.
Oh, right.
And I can't remember if this has been mentioned on the podcast that I went to school with him, but he's an old friend of mine, and it was one of those nice, let's go along and support a friend, and I enjoyed the show. Really? Okay, I obviously haven't mentioned it then.
No, not to me.
Not to drama school, that is. That's actually to secondary school before he went off to drama school. But I've known him for a long time, and it was let's go and support a friend, and while I'm at it, go and see a show that I thoroughly enjoy. And it was, with no demeaning intentions towards the performers, it was just a fraction below New York. But I think that's also because of the situation that it was in. You know, it was in a great theatre, and it had...
It was at the Garrick, wasn't it?
It was, yes. And it had a great deal of energy and all that. It just didn't have something that the New York theatre gave it. And I think the Garrick it's not the biggest theatre in London by any stretch, but it's also not one of the small ones. Seat numbers may go against me on that, but certainly in terms of feel.
The only fact I really know about the Garrick is it's kind of the answer to the Palace in terms of Gilbert and Sullivan, because you may or may not know that the Palace was built by Sullivan and D'Oyly Carte for opera. It was going to be the English Opera House, and so it was for its first 2 years. But Gilbert didn't want to have any part of that. But Gilbert did invest in a theatre in London himself, which is the Garrick.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so there is a Gilbert theatre and a Sullivan theatre, if you like.
Well, there you go. Learn something new every day. I love it. But yeah,
I'm not sure it's new, actually. They're both dead.
It was a great performance. Don't get me wrong. Yes. I thought Simon. Actually, I thought he. Oh, good lord, I've forgotten character names. Anyway, the character he played, who currently escapes me, I actually thought he did the best performance out of all of the people that I saw. It was fantastic.
Simon Lipkin is a remarkable actor.
He is a remarkable actor.
He was
absolutely
astounding as the puppeteer of the dog called Psycho, No, he wasn't called Psycho. What was he called? It was then called Barlow. He was originally going to be called Psycho.
In Simon Cowell.
In
X
I Can't
Factor.
Sing.
I
Yeah.
Can't Sing, that's it. I didn't see that, of course, unfortunately, which we found out to my detriment in the quiz episode.
But he was fantastic in that.
He is a very, very good
actor. And he also
actor.
had that ability to sort of look at the audience and make a gag. So he was also able to break the fourth wall as well as stay behind it when he needed to.
And I think that's one of the...
Which not every actor can do.
No, and it's one of the reasons he was so good in Rock of Ages, because Rock of Ages is just a string of gags and rock songs, essentially.
I assume it's a little bit fourth wall busting, isn't
Yes,
it?
very much so. There are points where he will look out at the audience and actually beg them for applause.
Oh, really?
In a sort of come on gesture with his
It's
hands to bring...
It's an egg you on kind of show.
It is 50...
Which you would get in a rock concert.
Yeah, it is 50% rock concert, to be perfectly honest. The story isn't, as far as jukebox musicals go, isn't the worst. It's not the best either, but it works for its purpose. It gets the songs across, and it's a great deal of fun, really.
So why did it close quicker than the almost perennial, although it has now gone, We Will Rock You?
I suspect it's because We Will Rock You is Queen.
Yeah.
And I think...
And unadulteratedly British, presumably.
Unadulteratedly British, whereas most of the songs... oh, good lord, I can't remember everything that's in it, but I think most of the songs that are in Rock of Ages are American.
The American rock end of the market.
Yes, which is, it's just a different thing.
Yeah. And that's fine.
I like both. I probably actually generally prefer American rock myself. But that's because I tend to be a bit more of a metalhead in my rock music tastes than some people. But I think Queen sells over here, really. Yes. Especially when you occasionally put Brian May on stage, which he did do.
Well, we like Queens both on the throne and on the radio, so...
Absolutely, yes. Add them on stage as well as a rock band. And
or Helen Mirren, depending on where you're going.
Well, yeah, quite. But We Will Rock You, I wasn't as taken with as I was with Rock of Ages.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it was when I saw it. I was perhaps in not... No, I was in a rock phase when I saw We Will Rock You. I'm not perhaps as up on my Queen as I should be as a British music fan, but...
Don't worry, you don't have to. I have no knowledge.
Fair enough.
If they didn't play it... is it a song called Higher and Higher? If they didn't play that at firework displays every year, I probably wouldn't know any Queen.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, I knew some. I'm certainly a fan of Bohemian Rhapsody and... I like a lot of their songs, to be fair, but I don't know their full repertoire, and there's definitely a few in We Will Rock You that I wasn't fully aware of. I went to see We Will Rock You eventually because my cousin by marriage, Rachel Tucker, was playing Meat, and it was her debut role after she was the runner-up or one of the runners-up in the Search for the Nancys.
In the Search for?
The Search for the Nancys, what was it? I Do Anything.
The television
Yes.
Search for a Nancy for Oliver.
Correct,
Sorry,
yes. Yes, I should clarify that. She
well,
was...
it's the Flight of the Conchords. The Search for the Nancys feels like a very odd sequel to that.
Quite. She made it through to the penultimate round.
Oh, truly?
And then she's had a stellar career since. She got... That really launched her. She went into Meat. She then went on and played Elphaba for quite some time and has just come back from New York. She was doing The Last Ship with Sting, which just closed about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think, so she's just coming back now. But that was the only reason I particularly went to see it, and I did enjoy it, but I'm not sure I would have gone to see it had I not had a pull, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
But yeah, I mean, I think, why did it close quicker? Musical taste, perhaps.
Also, if I may say, in Britain, it came after We Will Rock You started.
Yes.
So it had the feel,
substantially so.
It had the feel, at least over here, of being a cash-in.
I think perhaps I can see where that would come from, although it was a very, very different show. And obviously not band-specific. Like, there were lots and lots... Every song was by a different band. But I think also it was an American story. And that I feel like... Maybe I'm misjudging here, but I feel like the American mode of storytelling doesn't necessarily last as long over here. Especially when it's, with the greatest respect to the Rock of Ages writers, a relatively flimsy story.
Well, it's a jukebox. They all
absolutely.
I don't want anyone to go away thinking I've not seen either of the two shows we're talking about here, but and I'm not holding a torch for We Will Rock You at all, because as far as I can gather, the plot of that is also pretty stapled together in order to make the music work.
Yeah,
but
I personally don't think it's anywhere near as good as the plot of Rock of Ages, which says quite a lot, because the plot of Rock of Ages isn't amazing. Yeah. But I found the plot of We Will Rock You to be very out of place. I get why it was done the way it was, but it didn't work for me.
No, and that's a reasonable position, I think.
Yeah.
Well, they announced its closure so many times over the number of years. I mean,
they
it will be remembered as a very long-running show.
It will.
But when it first started, I remember it got pretty poor reviews.
It was quite rocky.
Its closure relatively quickly, and then it It was extended and extended and extended. So anyway, there we are. They've both gone.
They have both gone.
So what now?
Well, I'm going to start bouncing around chronologically because it's just going to be whatever I remember as it's. Yes, quite. I will actually, ironically, start at the end. Well, not quite. The end for me, in terms of the most recent thing I saw, would be Happy Ending, but that will have already been heard by the time this goes out, quite some time ago. But just before that, and it was my second time seeing the Scottsboro Boys.
Oh, right.
I went in December 2014, and then I went again in February 2015. I love that show. I think on the second viewing, it jumped straight up into my top 5 musicals, and I suspect it will sit there for quite some time.
The score, the show, the power, the performances? What has driven it so high up into your Premier League?
All of the above.
Oh, right.
Really, I've had the CD. I bought the CD when it very first came out, and I listened to it, and about half the show struck me as being brilliant, and the other half struck me as being something that I wasn't quite sure about because I didn't know the context. And I think I'm very careful when I hear a soundtrack. Sorry, Nick, an original cast recording. For the first time, that I don't know the context of everything that's going on, and I feel like some songs that you think, not sure about that, when you know why they're being sung, they become a lot more powerful.
And that is become contextualised,
absolutely true of the Scottsboro Boys. It's a true story, of course, which lends to emotion, especially when it's such a difficult story.
Well, it gives you power, doesn't it?
Yeah, and for the benefit of anyone who doesn't know, and by the time this goes out, this show will have, it may be back, but its current run will have been well and truly gone. But it's the story of 9 black boys from 1930s in America. They're caught on a train, hopping train to go to try and find work or get out of home, whatever it happens to be for each individual. And 2 white prostitutes were caught on the train, and in order to get out of going to jail, they said that the 9 boys raped them. And so the 9 boys were thrown into jail, not really given a fair trial. They have a really tough time of it. And
I'd rather think this may be in the South.
Yes, absolutely, yes. I believe, if I remember correctly, they were trying to... Oh, goodness. It's in Alabama. It's certainly set in Alabama. I think they were trying to get to Atlanta. I forget precisely where they were going. They never really get there. But the sad thing is that they had multiple trials, and one of the girls recanted and said, no, sorry, I was lying. They got all kinds of terrible legal advice and lawyers. They had an absolutely terrible time of it, and despite all of the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, they were never actually let go. Eventually, one of the lawyers cut a deal, 4 of them got out, none of them lasted any long, and the rest were basically left to rot. And it's a black mark that in sort of Alabama in general. I think it's been something that's been, if I understand correctly, and there's a certain amount of speculation here, they found it difficult to face. And I think that, Counter and Ebb being Counter and Ebb went, right, let's turn that into a musical, as only they can. And after something like Cabaret, they're not afraid of tackling difficult material, and they do it brilliantly.
They also use their trademark thing, which is a framework musical based around a genre or style. So,
absolutely.
As we know, Chicago is all about vaudeville.
Yep.
Cabaret is through the prism, if you like, of 1930s Weimar Republic sort of cabaret shows.
Mm-hmm.
Even The Kiss of a Spider Woman is through the medium of films.
Yep.
So this is done through the old sort of minstrelsy.
It is.
Tradition, shall we say.
But with a twist, which is that there's only one white person in the cast. The cast is, I want to say, 11, I think, black men, because there's the 9 boys and then the 2, Mr. Bones and Mr. Tambo, who sort of play all the other characters. 2 of the boys double up as the 2 prostitutes as well.
Oh, right. So no women in it?
There's the lady who's...
The clue's there, I suppose.
I don't really want to give away what she does, because her part in this is so powerful.
So there is a female.
There is a female part, which is, it's one of those things that leaves you puzzling the whole way through the show, and at the end you go, right, got it. Yeah. And then there's the interlocutor, who is the one white male who is sort of running all of this and saying to the boys, come on, let's do a minstrel show. Played spectacularly in this production by Mr. Julian Glover.
Oh, who's a fantastic actor.
Who is a fantastic actor, and not a terrible singer. Yeah. He doesn't hold the best tune, but because he acts so, he's got the Dame Judy thing. He acts well enough that he can carry it through. And he's this great sort of ever so slightly doddery old man when he's the interlocutor, but there's a couple of times where he plays a judge or the sheriff or something like that, and the power that he carries with him in those moments is extremely strong.
He's one of those actors who has authority.
Absolutely.
And can use it when he needs it, yeah.
Now, what's really sad about this, particularly given... Now, this is me sort of looking at things on a very surface level, but given that Julian Glover's in Game of Thrones, he's an active person in the public visage at the moment, this is not a show that is selling well. And at the time that we're recording this, it has 1 week left. It closes 1 week today. And
but the reviews have been astounding.
The reviews have been astounding. And it is a transfer. It transferred from the Young Vic, where it played last year. And it's an absolutely deserving transfer, and I kind of wish it could just run in that theatre for another 10 years. It absolutely deserves to. But it's not selling. I went on... When did I go? I went on a Wednesday matinee first time around, and it was maybe just under half full, and most of that was school groups. I then went on a weekday night, I can't remember which one, and it was maybe 60% full. It wasn't doing brilliantly, and actually both times I went, I spoke to a few members of the cast afterwards, and they said the same thing, it's just not selling properly. Part of me wonders if some people find out what they're walking into and run away from it.
Well, it is a heavy thing to be.
It is a very heavy, and to be fair, the same thing happened with 12 Years a Slave, the film that came out. The subject matter is extremely difficult, and I don't begrudge anybody who feels that then they're not really wanting to deal with it. I feel like it's a shame, because I feel like it presents it like it's difficult not to smile throughout most of this show. You will cry in parts, absolutely. It had me devastated multiple times, but it's not a depressing show, and that's one of what Kander and Ebb, they're great at making things light.
Well, here's my question to you, I suppose, is do you think it has anything to do with the economic context we find ourselves in? I only ask because people don't have as much disposable income as they had.
This is true.
Haven't had it for ages. And the thing I've noticed, I think, is that the difficult shows are passing away, and for the most part, people are reverting to their comfort zone, which is one of the things we're seeing. In fact, more than anything else, it's not people are going to lighter shows; they're just going for stuff they know. So we're getting Miss Saigon back, we're getting Cats back, we're getting pretty much everything.
And then you've got your Wicked's and your Billy Elliots and Phantoms and Les Mises that are just staples. And I think actually,
we'll have more of the same. Thank you. Seems to be what the public want at the moment.
Well, we sort of talked about this with Edinburgh, didn't we? And I think in context of Out of the Lens as well, is it's just difficult to get people to spend money on something when they don't know what they're going into.
Yep.
And I rather feel... And actually, you know what? The second time I went to see this, there was a woman sitting about 3 rows in front of me who actually called over one of the ushers and asked what the show was about.
A bit late to make that...
Well, actually, in all honesty, so this is an hour and 45 minutes, I think, with no interval, and I was mildly surprised when she didn't leave.
Oh, right, okay.
I was... Maybe that's me being a hideous cynic, but I rather assumed that from the fact that she'd came in not knowing what it was about, it was going to be a bit difficult for her, but to her credit, she didn't. And if you happen to listen to this, madam, all kudos to you for staying put. They have walkouts. They actually said that, which they don't have a problem with, because they feel like that says they're doing their jobs. They're getting the story over so powerfully that some people can't take it. And actually, I'm glad that they see it that way, especially given that this is 3 or 4 of it's their West End debuts.
Yes.
There's 3 or 4 of them. I think that this is their first time. There's 3 or 4 that were brought over from New York, and the rest are fairly established, I think, over here. So theoretically a difficult thing to deal with, but they seem to be taking it in their stride, which I'm glad about. But yeah, a fabulous show. Amazing choreography as well. That needs to be given a nod, because it's just incredible. Especially commencing in Chattanooga, I read a review of the original Broadway thing that said they thought it was possibly the best train song that had been written in decades. And actually I think they're absolutely right, but it could be very easily let down without the choreography. And I thought the choreography for that was beautiful.
Question then.
Yeah.
It's Kander and Ebb, so we know we're in a safe pair of hands.
Yes.
Unfortunately for the last time, of course.
Sadly, yes.
However, it's the minstrelsy thing. Now, obviously, the contrast of what minstrelsy is now recognised as being against the cultural mores of the time and the injustice that brings makes a perfect fit.
Yes.
But it's not a jukebox musical. These are new songs.
They are.
So they are new songs in the style of the minstrel tradition.
Yes.
They are black actors. They don't black up, though, do they?
Spoiler alert, yes they do.
Ah, right.
Right at the very, very end, the final song, when they sort of keep interrupting the song to say what happened to them, they come on stage in a kick line facing the back with the red jackets and the black trousers and the top hats, and then they turn around and they're all in blackface.
And obviously that ties in very much with the feel and politics of the time, shall we say.
Yes.
And it shows that, unfortunately, whatever happens in the story, without giving too much away, but you've already explained some of it, that outcome is predictable because of the circumstances they found themselves in at a time over which they had no control.
Correct.
Perfectly understandable. And also there is a tradition, certainly in the late Victorian, early part of the 20th century, believe it or not, for black performers to adopt blackface, because it gave them, oddly, equality with white actors who were using blackface.
Yes.
Which actually opened doors for them whilst also closing them. It passed them through a narrow way onto the stage, but it also meant they couldn't then diversify from that, not easily.
Quite so.
So it's a very interesting tradition in that sense. But for the most part, up to that point, they are not. They're singing minstrelsy songs, but they're not doing it in what we would call the black and white minstrel look here in Britain.
Quite.
So how is it for you, as a 21st century sophisticated theatre-going gentleman with liberal tendencies, if I may describe you thus, to watch, irrespective of, I mean, you can't strip it away from the context of the show.
No.
But to hear minstrel-style songs being sung by black men.
Well, one of the things that's quite powerful is the whole way through the show, the interlocutor is trying to encourage the cakewalk to happen. There's
Which is a famous sort of dance of the 1910s.
It's how the minstrel shows would end.
Yeah.
That was their big finale. It was the traditional finale. And actually, there is a brief one at the beginning of the show, but then he keeps trying to make a real one happen. And, spoiler alert, when it gets to the very end of the show, and he starts encouraging them to do it, while he's facing the front and trying to start it off himself, they're all taking the blackface off, and then they just ignore him and walk away. And it's a very, very powerful moment, actually. It's not all minstrel songs either. There's a couple of things. There's actually one very, very beautiful traditional spiritual type number, which was very, very effective. It's gorgeous singing. There's a couple of beautiful solos, which I don't know the minstrelsy well. I've seen clips of it, but I think I've seen the cliche clips rather than necessarily seeing. I don't know what a whole show would comprise of, let's put it that way. But there's a couple of very heartfelt solos that I think are out of character. But the big thing, of course, is when they turn around at the end and they are in blackface. And yes, I think perhaps, well, I'm helped by two things here, one of which is I see that as being a piece of cultural history.
Yes.
I don't, I appreciate it for how much can be held against it, particularly with a contemporary point of view, but
it's
I
what
also...
it represents,
it's the
rather than
product
what
of... Well, that's it, and it's the product of its time, and in its time, it was a bit mocking, it was dark, but it didn't have it didn't encourage the contempt that it would today in a white audience particularly.
No, I think you're quite right, yes.
I know that it was looked down upon by the African American people at the time, but perhaps not. Again, I think that's probably... and I'm not trying to speak for a people here, but I feel like they probably feel, again, more strongly about it now, maybe, than they did then. Maybe I'm misjudging that, I don't know. I'm just going on the reactions of a couple of people I've spoken to. But for me, it was very much they went there, and then I was back into it again. Yes. It wasn't the massive break, and I have seen a few people in the audience who almost can't get their heads around the fact that this is happening in front of them, especially to see black actors blacking up. I think it would have been less surprising for them if Julian Glover had come out in the black, which he doesn't. But
it is very much true to the tradition, because as I say,
yeah, absolutely,
there were black-faced black actors.
Absolutely, and but I think perhaps that's a tradition that isn't so well known these days. I think probably a lot of people see blackface and they think of white people pretending to be black, which is how it started.
And was predominantly the case, yes.
Yeah.
And certainly within a British context, and that's what we're talking about, a West End show here, although it's obviously an American one. Forgive me, the obvious resonance is shamefacedly with I use the word advisedly, with the televised version of the black and white minstrel show, which was still on until the 70s. Hard to believe, but there we are.
Well, given that it's such a mockery of a people, which is I believe how it started. I'm not sure if it began mocking or if it began
the thing about
caricature.
The television, I'm not in any way advocating it, but the thing about the television black and white minstrel shows is it wasn't trying to be offensive. No. It was trying to entertain. It just is massively offensive.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it's very short-sighted and considerably worse than that, really. But I'm not, as I say, I'm in no way advocating on behalf of it, but we have to remember once again the context. And certainly within Britain, where I've had cause to say this on a different episode of Musical Talk. For us, black history is more to do with the empire in Africa, whereas in America, where a great deal of our culture comes from, but is imported from America, black culture is very much within the Afro-American context. So we don't have the same paths, as it were, culturally.
Absolutely, and I think
therefore we do look at things, or have had cause to look at things in a different way.
Yeah.
There we are.
I think that's true, and I think because we didn't have the same level of uprising within particularly within the country. It took us a long time to wake up to what we were doing with that, which, I mean, I probably shouldn't say too much more on this, just because I'm conscious that I may be stepping in a minefield, and my knowledge of minstrelsy and its context within the people of its time is actually very slim.
But to take it back to the West End
yes.
show, now gone, but you would rate it tremendously highly.
I couldn't speak high. I saw it. I missed it in Broadway by about 3 weeks, I think, the first time I went. I missed it in the West End by about 2 months when I came back in July 2013. And so, come hell or high water, I was going to make sure I saw it this time around. And I saw it, I went in for that first time, and I walked out, and I started trying to work out when I could go back. It was just amazing. I think it deserved much bigger audiences and much more recognition than it got, widely speaking. And I really hope it gets brought back, if by the time this goes out it hasn't been already. And if you get the opportunity to go and see a good production of this, go and see it. Really get tickets as quickly as you can, because it's such a powerful piece of theatre, and everything in it, from the blackface to the all-male cast to the all-black cast, with all-male apart from the lady, of course.
And all-black apart from Julian Glover, but I get the point.
Yeah.
Predominantly, I think it's the word we're struggling for here.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's just so well used. Yes, it's controversial, but that's the point.
Yeah, well, theatre
because the whole thing is controversial. And one thing I'd like to just mention before we move on to something else, and I don't know how much this was something that was... It may have nothing to do with the musical whatsoever, but I can't help noticing that it happened after the musical came out, which is that in 2013, the Scottsboro Boys were actually posthumously pardoned by the governor of Alabama.
Oh, right.
Now, whether that has anything to do with cultural awareness around the country as a result, although actually it was very high at the time, there were people all over the country advocating to have the Scottsboro Boys released. It's just Alabama did things their way and weren't going to budge. Whether or not that is as a result of raised cultural awareness, I don't know. I could be putting words into people's mouths and projecting something that isn't there. But they do say this at the end of the musical. It gets broadcast after the curtain call. It just says in 2013, Governor of Alabama posthumously pardoned the Scottsboro Boys. So just as a
time coming.
Well, yes, absolutely, far too long. Many, 80 years too late, essentially. But I think that deserves to be mentioned, just to round off the story, especially if the show is not around when this is broadcast.
Musical talk. There we are, David Kingsmill there, with the first part of a two-part conversation about his West End stage Oddysey. Do join us again next week, and we'll be talking about Stephen Ward, From Here to Eternity, Miss Saigon, Dogfight, Book of Mormon, Dickens Abridged, and No Way to Treat a Lady. So quite a lot of conversation yet to still have about some of these recent gems which David saw in the West End only relatively recently. It's like a rather splendid walk down memory lane, but realising you've only got to go about 3 or 4 yards from the house to get to where you're going. Just beyond the rockery, really. And frankly, that's all there is to be said about this week's episode, so do join us again next week for that interesting discussion. And having advertised next week's programme, I have very little further to say, so I know when I'm beaten, it's very painful, so I will stop. And the best way of stopping an episode of Musical Talk is something along the lines of this. Goodbye. Works every time. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos Ribbits and David Kingsmill, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2016. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our brand new website, musicaltalkpodcast.weebly.com, or subscribe to us on iTunes, and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.
And
Someone please for lights down in the Olivier.